Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to walk you through a still life painting. This is a very in-depth painting where I'm going to walk you through all the steps, and I'm also going to talk to you about the importance of learning with still life. I'm pretty passionate about it. In fact, whenever I was in my undergrad program, we started by painting still lifes almost exclusively. We did them so much that I remember my third semester when we finally were able to paint whatever we wanted. I vowed to never paint them again, and lo and behold, it became kind of my calling card for a few years earlier in my career. I'm revisiting this subject matter because I have a book coming out. It's Modern Still Life from Fruit Bowls to Disco Balls, and it's all about still life and the fundamentals of painting through this genre. I'm pretty passionate about it. We'll get to all of those things. First to note, I have my reference photo on the bottom left-hand part of this screen. You're welcome to use it and paint it. All I ask is that if you paint it, just simply tag me. I appreciate it. The credit goes a long way for career artists, but it's a pretty fun photo. A little bit of background with this photo is years ago, I remember having a client who commissioned me to do a custom still life, and I think I did a few iterations in photo form before we finally picked one. This one didn't make the cut. She really wanted jalapenos in there. This one obviously does not have jalapenos, and so it was scrapped. Don't worry, me and my kids ate this delicious fruit breakfast. Nothing goes to waste in our house. But the photo collected dust on my phone, metaphorically, of course, and I'm doing a big push right now for my book. I'm painting a lot of still lifes, and I thought that this would be a wonderful opportunity to paint one of these, and I wanted to record this also so you guys could see all the steps and how it came together. So as we can see on the screen right now, I am doing sort of a big block in. That's kind of how I refer to this. So a question I used to get a lot in the beginning of my career was people would look at these big elaborate paintings I would make, and they would say something to the tune of, well, I could never paint something that big or that elaborate. And I began showing my process. So I would take a photo after I drew in my still life, and then in this block in stage, and then in all the middle iterations where everything's messy and still kind of looking wild, and then finally when it started to come together at the end. And people would say, oh, I get it now. Like, there's a process to it. It does get messy. You sort of see the light at the end of the tunnel, and then it sort of makes sense at the end. And I remember that was kind of my first tiptoe into teaching. It was just showing people, I like to say, you know, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Hopefully, of course, you're not actually eating elephants, but you know what I mean. It's the idea that something that looks so big and daunting, and, you know, sometimes representational painting can fall into that category, unfortunately. Once you realize that it's just slowly building up form before you get all the details, and let's say, for example, the ice pitcher, which you'll see at the very end does look really detailed. But before you get to that point, it's just a wash of green, and then it's a wash of green with white, you know, I don't know, ellipse shapes in there. And then you start to carve out more of the nuances as you go. And the key here is that a lot of times it's hard to know exactly where to place the details. I think we have a studio visitor in there. My daughter likes to come in and visit me while I'm painting. However, back to what I was saying, in order to know where to put the highlights in the picture of ice, you have to have some information underneath to respond to. I always think it's really impressive when I see painters who can sort of paint like, you know, a printer, where they sort of start top to bottom, left to right, and I think to each their own as far as style. But I've always been the kind of painter who I need information to respond to in order for me to make the best color and value choices on, you know, this pastry or the watermelon or in the glasses. I have to have my base sort of in the ballpark of where I'm wanting to go. So knowing this, you know, I do this block in. I tell myself the magic is like getting it 75% of the way there. And I know with art, a lot of us are working with alongside our inner perfectionist. That's what makes us have the drive to keep pushing and keep working. And, you know, I hesitate to say like, you should get, you know, not have an inner perfectionist, or, you know, that's a bad thing. It's an asset for an artist because it helps us define our taste. But when we let that part of us sort of steer the ship, especially early in our painting process, what can happen is we get so hung up on it looking perfect that it really slows down our pace. And one thing I teach a lot with my students, whether it's through a book or my online course or in-person workshops, is perfect is really the enemy of good or good enough. And especially when you can keep going in and refining, you don't want to let perfect sort of slow you down. So why is speed important? You know, sometimes I think there's a good sentiment out there about, you know, fast isn't always good. And I totally agree with that. You know, it's not important that you put out a painting a week or that you can paint quickly. But I would argue that when your speed is being inhibited by a lot of stress, fear, anxiety, and an unwillingness to put something down because it might be wrong, I feel like that lacking of speed can actually be a bit of a liability. By the end of my painting, when I'm making my final marks, I do slow down significantly, but in the beginning, I use a larger brush so I can be faster and make more general shapes. I push myself to sort of quickly and intuitively make marks, as opposed to sort of pushing myself to a point where I'm perfectly finding colors, values, shapes, forms, drawing, etc. And while yes, the speed does, I think, cause some mistakes, the trick is really getting yourself to a point where you're again, that 75-80% accuracy. It's closer than the bright orange background that I started with. And if I can confidently say, yes, I moved the needle in the right direction, we're much closer than we were when we started, or even at the drawing stage, then I am comfortable to move on. And it's important to note that I'm painting this with acrylic paint. This is very similar with a lot of gouache and certainly with oil. You can let the layer underneath dry and you can paint on top of it fairly opaquely, which just means it covers really well. And the reason why this is important is because let's say I make these loquats, for example, too big, or the highlight too big, or the shadow color too dark, too bright. All I have to do is let it dry and then go back in and sort of adjust it. Like, nothing is impermanent. You know, I think a lot of times with painting, there's really an inevitability of having to do studies for a painting, even if you're not, like, you don't consider yourself a person who needs to do those. A study, for example, is just, it's like doing a little bit of research before you jump into a real formal painting. And so for some people, that's doing sketches in a journal, composition sketches, value sketches, color sketches, etc. I don't do a lot of those most of the time. There are exceptions. But with a painting like this, for example, I don't often do sketches. But my painting, my first couple layers, I sometimes think of those as studies. It kind of takes the pressure off of myself. You know, and if I get something wrong, like, for example, I used to get the drawing wrong a lot. Being, you know, my drafting skills have always been, I think, the last skill for me to develop. And so a very common thing in the seri practice, and it's going to be different for everyone, is I would get the values and colors in the ballpark, but then I would realize that, like, my dragon fruit, for example, were way too big. And I'd have to go in and, like, shrink them. And yes, it would mean little bits of yellow and gray would end up in the loquats. And, you know, there's the idea that you can then go in and completely cover it. But sometimes letting the little bits of it peek through kind of made it like a signature seri painting. And you can allow that more, like, perfectionist part of you to discern with more information if you want to do that or not. So, you know, I made a drawing flub underneath my painting. I rolled with the punches, and instead of getting really precious about it and letting it, you know, slow me down or take the wind out of my sails or really bum me out, I sort of just allowed it to be a little bit of an exploration in the context of a painting. And I almost feel like I have a few iterations of the painting underneath the finished product, if that makes any sense. And we can see in this process, you know, I created, again, that understudy, that underpainting, where everything was, again, just 75-80% of the way there. And now in this step, you're seeing me do this now, I'm starting to perfect. And what I typically do is I don't completely solve object by object at this point. I really try to hold back from the very final steps of completing an object. For example, this, like, margarita and the pitcher, I don't think I would ever completely finish that on the second or third pass, however you want to contextualize this process. But I get it most of the way there. The nice thing about sort of doing that that really rough underpainting where I sort of just have the basic forms, is that helps me determine if the composition and the colors are good enough. Like, so for example, your details, so the little seeds on the dragon fruit, the highlights on the ice, the shiny bits on the bottle, things like that, that admittedly do make a painting feel very luscious. It's usually the fun part to look at, but it's important as artists that we remember that those things that feel so luscious and lovely to us and might be really nice details don't actually do very much of the heavy lifting when it comes to the composition and the color story happening within your painting. What I mean by that is, so for example, when I teach composition to my students, sometimes I'll have them take a series of photos for still life, for example, because it's a great subject matter to learn. More on that in a moment. But I'll have my students take a bunch of different photos, and when they're deciding which ones they're going to paint, I'll have them look at it in the thumbnail format. So the tiny little mini photos it generates in a photo editing app. So I use VSCO a lot, and it'll be laid out like a grid. And in that instance, I can sort of see which composition looks good. And since the image is so small, I don't see any of the detail or very little of the detail. And whichever image looks most compelling in that tiny, shrunken, undetailed form, it's usually a really good sign that that has good balance and composition and color going for it. And then the details are just sort of the icing on top. I think sometimes we get so enamored with like the lovely highlight on an orange or the sparkle on a glass of juice, or, you know, all the lovely things that make us want to paint stuff, that we can forget how important the composition is. And so again, that's why I really like this approach, because you know, composition is one of those things where you don't want to be at the last bit and realize that it's wonky or off balance. And by sort of flushing it out in that first step, when you're moving really quick and nothing is precious, you know, while you're watching this, I hope you can see that I got the painting to a spot where you roughly knew what was going on with the composition within the first 5 minutes, which I think would translate in real time to maybe in the first hour or so, maybe even less than an hour. And so it gives you a clue very early on as to, is this painting worth sort of going back and forth over the details for? And I'll just say, especially in the beginning of my career, there were many times where in that first stage, that first block-in stage, I realized something was off, the balance was wrong, and it gives you the opportunity then to move things around, as opposed to doing sort of the printer approach, top to bottom, left to right, and you realize halfway through perfecting half of the objects in your painting that the composition's way off. So, you know, for that reason, I also think it helps you to have a more harmonious painting, both in forms of contrast and color and composition, when you work sort of this loose and general to more specific. Another thing I wanted to bring up in this painting, which the dragon fruit that I'm painting right now is a great example of, is this idea of like going in and carving out. So when it comes to drawing within a painting, you have a few approaches to it. One of them is, obviously you can actually go in and draw. So I've seen some artists use like a pencil or marker. I always just use paint. That's just my style. You can go in with line and draw, and you can see that I did that in my first step, and I think at one point I did a redraw with the blue lines, and then you can fill in, so to speak. Or, we try not to think of painting as like a coloring book. I remember first day of my first painting class, my painting professor said, we are not learning how to color in, that if your paintings look like a paint by number, especially as you're learning, you're doing something wrong. Now, of course, there's no wrong in the art world. If someone's trying to make something look like a paint by number, conceptually, that's fantastic. But in the beginning, you want to make sure you avoid some of those mistakes. Anyways, all that to say, you want to have your paints look kind of lived in. It's hard for me to articulate that perfectly. All I know is that if you go to a museum, especially if you look at sort of impressionist and post-impressionist work, the paint almost feels like a tapestry, and it's not even like an abstract thing. It doesn't mean that only abstract paintings can have that. I paint pretty representational, and that's a quality that I very much intentionally go for. And one of the ways you can do this is another aspect of drawing, which is carving in and out with negative space. So, for example, I'm painting this picture, and let's say that lip of the picture, the very top part, gets too big, too thick. It's much thinner. I can go in with the white background color and carve it out and make it thinner, and I'm using my negative space to reinforce that line. So sometimes we think of drawing, we think of our first and earliest exposure to drawing, which was taking a pencil on a white piece of paper and drawing a line. But imagine a world where you draw a line, but then you carve out the line on either side with whiteout. That is another aspect of the drawing. And that's something I do a lot in this particular painting that I wanted to draw attention to. I'll have some people say, well, how do you get the lips of your glasses to be so crisp, or, the seeds in your dragon fruit to not look like you just put little black stickers on them, and have that really artificial look. And it's because there's what I like to refer to as a dialogue between the positive space and the negative space. So positive space is, for the example of the dragon fruit, the seeds, and the negative space is the flesh around it. For this glass that I'm drawing, the positive space would be the liquid and the lime slice and the rim of the glass where, you're able to see that lip. And then the negative space is sort of the little crescent of the see-through glass, and obviously all of the space around the glass. And I'm using both of those to carve out these nice, crisp, accurate lines. And I think that that's an underrated aspect of painting that can happen, that people sort of forget that drawing is less about finding this teeny tiny little brush and balancing your arm and not ever shaking and perfectly creating a line the first go. And it's really through working back and forth. And again, that dialogue. So you go in with a positive line to create the lip of the glass, and then you carve it back out and it's too skinny, and then you go back in and you do that, however many times you need, rinse and repeat. I love the idea that this approach allows people with maybe not the steadiest hand to have a chance at really controlling their drawing. I think for me, I don't know that painting would be so fun if I didn't have that tool in my toolbox. The ability to sort of go in with a line, get the idea down. Okay, the line is too wobbly and not quite accurate enough, and too thick, but I can go back in and try to carve it out, and I can do that as many times as I need. And if you're curious, like, okay, well, how could I develop this skill? There's lots of ways to do this. I think a lot of images call for that sort of, again, dialogue. But one drill you could do is you could go in and try to paint text. So you could go take a picture of like a billboard that has a lot of text on it and try to paint that, because a lot of times with text, you're really inclined to sort of take the tiniest little brush, and we have all that memory and knowledge in our hand of how to write, and we just go in and write. But I find that treating it like anything else you would paint, and obviously you're going to go in and make it too thick, and then you go back in and carve it out, and that's a really hardcore example of how you could practice that if you feel so inclined. And I will just say, like, accuracy I think is a little overrated. I mean, I love a good Alice Neel, and as much as I've gotten to a point where I can do some relative accuracy, I think for me personally, I love the charm of something sort of straddling the line between representational and cartoon, and my particular approach puts me sort of in that position. Okay, but for a second, I wanted to talk a little bit about why I think still life is so important. I want to give a little context too. Sometimes, I think when people are newer to painting, there's a lot of times in the art world, you have to invite in the context of art history to sort of understand the precedent of what's going on. Like, what I mean by that is, if you start painting and maybe you're self-taught, which by the way is an incredibly valid way to learn art. I will say, as someone who has juried and curated my fair share of online exhibitions and magazine entries, I do not ever personally look for education. I think sometimes it can be enlightening to know that, but it's never ever a determinant. And I've met with plenty of other artists who think that. Obviously, do I know and can I guarantee that this is always the case? No, I suppose not. But I can tell you personally that it is the work that does the talking for you. Okay, I'll get back off my soapbox. But why still life? So there used to be a hierarchy, and this is, I would say, kind of a little specific to like the French salon. So think like, the 18th century, a little bit into the 19th century, of there was a clear hierarchy of different genres, and the lines between genres, again, at this point in time in contemporary painting, it feels a little arbitrary, but there were scenes that depicted Greek mythology and certainly, Christian religion in the West. And I will say that this is a specifically contextualizing Western painting tradition. But there was this idea that, these religious depictions were the highest form of art, right? It was the best money for it, the most revered, the most skilled artists got these kinds of jobs, right? And then there were portraits of, famous people. And of course, because they're famous and they're royal, it lends a significant amount of credibility. But also, there was this humanist movement that sort of happened in Europe and Greek and classical revival that said to capture the human form was, to sort of capture the essence of our maker, of God. So there was like this sort of element of that made it the second kind of tier. And then we sort of have landscape and then genre painting, or even still life painting kind of below that. And still life has gone in and out of fashion. Another fun fact about still life is that during sort of the time when these Dutch merchants were starting to sail and have trade and making a lot of money, one of the ways that they would sort of assert their newfound dominance was by displaying their virtue through still life. So it's kind of ironic in a way, although I don't think it's too removed from some of the things we do in our culture, of sort of bragging about your riches, but also acknowledging that it's like fickle and vain. So it was like this very lacking in self-awareness sort of brag. They would hire these great painters to paint, food decaying and, acknowledging that money is vain and showcasing their piousness through these commissions. Anyways, it's very fun to study on its own. But all that to say, still life has had this very precarious moment in history. And I've even witnessed it in my own career. I was born in the 90s. I'm not like way, early 20th century artist. I'm sort of more contemporary. And I think what's interesting about it is when I started painting these and kind of making them my calling card for a little bit in my career and even getting shows, there was a lot of people would say, and I just sort of picked it. It wasn't weird to me, but I would get feedback to the tune of, oh, why still life? Or, oh, isn't still life just for learning? And I will say it's greatly diminished. Still life has become a very popular thing to paint. I think it's had a bit of a renaissance, especially in social media, because it's a really accessible form of art for people to enjoy and purchase and be a part of. And I think in that way it's really good. I'm all for everything that's accessible and inviting more people who maybe wouldn't have thought of themselves as art people into the fold. But I've always been passionate about it. And as someone who has developed a teaching practice pretty parallel, alongside their own painting practice, I've always enjoyed it because it's a great way to get in the weeds of composition really quickly. Even just the exercise of having a plate of fruit and moving them around, and taking reference photos or even painting from life and having that immediacy of controlling your composition is wonderful. One of the things I think can really develop as a weak spot for a lot of painters is composition, because if you think about it, sometimes you can just make a composition simply to dive in and start painting, right? The goal is I want to make a painting, so I won't think about the way I arrange my objects. I'll just put them on a counter and simply dive right in. And I noticed that more developed painters have gotten a better sense of composition, but it develops more slowly because if you think about it, you're spending less time in that process. But I've always taught my students to be really intentional, and I've given them lots of tips and tricks in order to develop that composition. So one of the exercises I do in my international painting retreats or workshops is I will have us spend a whole afternoon setting up still life. So I'll have them group into groups of 3 or 4, and then I'll have 4 or 5 stations. They'll set up a still life, take photos, make a sketch from life, and then after 20-30 minutes I'll have them switch stations and go to the next station, and then rinse and repeat. And that's always really fun, and people walk away with a lot of good reference photos. And more importantly, it feels like they're doing what might take a painter 6 months of really constant painting and creating their own setups in the span of an afternoon. And so I really appreciate still life for that accessibility. And can you do that with figure and landscape? Sure, but I find that it tends to be a little more easier and more manageable in sort of a still life setting. Another reason I think still life is great for students is because you can sort of see the interaction of light and shadow and color bouncing off of other color and treating surface material in a way that's a little more controlled than you can with some other formats. Now, I could hear an argument for other, landscape and stuff having just as much value. And I'm certainly not saying one is better, but there's just a certain amount of control with like the light and the subject matter and the ability to really simplify if need be that I think makes still life a bit of a standout in this arena. Which brings me to talking a little bit about my book. It's so funny how long a book process takes. I'm fully planning on making a podcast episode where I answer all of y'all's questions about making a book, so I won't talk about that here. But early in the process, when I was reached out to by the editor, she was like, I want to do a still life book with you. I know you've done a bunch of different subject matter. Every one of my companies a little hesitant about still life because it's kind of a sleepy, not so exciting subject matter, and I totally get that. And, I remember making the case, I'm very partial to them, even just personally, but that you could make them exciting and they don't just have to be, a skull and a candle and some rotting fruit on a table, that it could be anything. A subject that I really went into back in my sort of mid to late 20s was a still life series about nostalgia. And I remember doing this series of work. I started collecting things in thrift stores that were things I wanted as a child but couldn't purchase because I grew up very poor, below the poverty line in the Ozarks. Anyways, I started just compulsively sort of collecting these things that I wanted when I was a kid, but I couldn't because I exclusively shopped at thrift stores, and it was a very meta moment for me. But in the moment, I didn't know why I was collecting these because I was just doing landscapes at that point. And at one point I looked at these items and I was like, I should paint these. I should do something with these. They're just collecting dust. What am I doing? And it was a really fun breakthrough moment for me. I remember being inspired by a Smashing Pumpkins song that was talking about reflecting on your youth and sort of the last sort of vapors of like childhood evaporating in your mid-20s. And it totally feels like that. And I wanted to sort of process a lot of the yearning and desire for these objects that I had as a kid. As a grown-up, you develop a little more understanding and bandwidth for you can't always have what you want. And there's a little less social stigma for not keeping up with the latest trends, right? I would never feel embarrassed as a 30-year-old for not having a Stanley Cup in the same way I did as a 15-year-old for not having any branded Hollister clothes, right? And so to honor sort of that experience and find community with other people who felt that way, I painted these objects. I explored why do we feel nostalgia? What do these objects do for us? And I think still life is a great way to explore the depth of objects. And so, I've let off the gas on that body of work. I think what's really fun about it is it spurred a lot of other people to make nostalgic still life and to look inward and expand on it in their own right, which is always really exciting. I think, whenever you can sort of be part of a community doing something, especially as artists where we're so isolated, it can be really fun. But it's for those reasons that I really encourage people to try out still life, whether it's for more of a meaningful body of work where they explore sort of the psychology behind objects. I'm also a big believer that you can paint a portrait using objects. Even this commission, of course, it didn't actually end up being the commission, it got axed, but this was supposed to be this woman's love letter to living and growing up in Austin and all the beautiful produce and food that she ate living in Austin. And, I think an Austin native could look at this and go, oh yes, I can taste it. It feels like Austin. It feels like summer. The pan dulce, the watermelon, the margaritas, and you can really capture a lot more than you would think, even with a pretty straightforward display of objects in this particular still life. So I'm hoping while you're watching this, some things are connecting for you. Watching my process, I'm hoping that you're realizing that, I'm, as far as like the big color shapes, forms, I'm really not so far off of what I did in the first 5 minutes, but by simply moving down in brush size, so getting smaller and smaller brushes and making tinier and more focused adjustments, I'm dialing in on that accuracy. And slowly the painting, I feel like it almost like emerges from the smoke kind of whenever I'm working on this. In the moment, while I'm painting this, I feel kind of like, the best way I can describe it is like I'm playing whack-a-mole. Like I get something sort of moved in the right direction and something else will sort of scream at me that it's like really unfinished or undeveloped, and then I'll go to that. But part of why I'm able to play that game is because I did so much work in that first initial block in. So if you're watching this and you're sort of thinking, well, how can I start to apply some of these ideas and themes and concepts into my own painting practice? The thing I would really emphasize is having a good sense and the braveness and boldness to move around the big colors and forms in the beginning, and not get precious. I think a lot about my painting professor, who was really instrumental in my own life and in my own practice, obviously. But we're both from the Ozarks, which is like a very casual, there's a casualness to that culture. But, and he would say, don't polish a turd, which I know is like not the cutest term, but it was amazing because it got the point across so wonderfully, which is to say that, in the beginning, like let's say, things are all slightly off as far as drawing and like there's some structural stuff, like keep using that big brush to move things around, to get the colors and the balance in the right big general shapes. And then once you get to that point, then you can play that whack-a-mole, then you can start to go in and polish and refine and fine. But I can't emphasize enough the importance of starting big and committing to that bigness and the form and the composition, and then allowing yourself to begin to tunnel in and find those forms. If you ever get that step inverted, I find that it really creates like a novice sort of look to a painting, and it also, I think, ends up being a really frustrating process. A lot of times when I coach artists, there's this moment where I'll see this happen in their work. There's so much about, like, let's say it's a portrait, for example, the hair, the proportions, the color, the value, that's great, but let's say that there was like a drawing issue in the bottom half of the face, and that lack of willingness to go in with the big brush early and keep moving things around until it's all in the right place, it shows by the end of it, and there's no amount of polishing and refining that's going to fix a big error like this. And I think the process is more enjoyable when you let your painting be messy and crazy in the beginning, and you find the big shapes and the big relationships and the big proportions, and then you can go in and slowly refine, both in finding details and also in getting that color and that contrast. One of the things you're seeing me do now is get that white background to really play, be more bright in value. And you can see that what that ends up creating is that nice contrasty finished look that, I sort of worked on throughout the painting. So yeah, I'm hoping that this was helpful to watch come together in real time. It starts messy, and then you just play whack-a-mole until you look at it and you realize that I think I might be done with this painting, which is always a really pretty glorious thing to experience. Of course, now I'm trying desperately to get some content here. I miss the days you could just post photos and let your work find its people that way. But alas, here we are filming. But again, I hope that it was worth it. I hope you enjoyed watching this and you walk away with some confidence, especially in those early steps. I hope that you really take that with you, and yeah, enjoy your process. If this was helpful, please let me know. Take care, and as always, I wish you the best and happy creating.